A United States senator stands in a dimly lit parlor, holding a piece of paper that could destroy everything he's built. His hands tremble, not from cold, from terror, because what he's about to do isn't just scandalous. In 1841 America, it's impossible, illegal in most states, social suicide, political annihilation, and yet he's going to do it anyway. His name is Richard Mentor Johnson, Vice President of the United States under Martin Van Buren, war hero who supposedly killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames, Kentucky congressman for nearly 3 decades, and the man standing across from him, about to witness his signature, is a freed black woman named Julia Chinn. Except she's not just any freed woman, she's the woman he's loved for over 20 years, the mother of his 2 daughters. And according to every law, every custom, every rule of 1840s American society, she should not exist in his world. But she does. And what happens next will become one of the most suppressed, most controversial, most deliberately erased stories in American political history. Because Richard Johnson didn't just have a relationship with Julia Chinn, he married her. In secret. In defiance of laws that said interracial marriage was a crime. And when word got out, it didn't just end his career, it nearly tore the country apart. But here's what makes this story truly impossible. Julia Chinn had been dead for 5 years by the time Johnson supposedly married her. So who was the woman he married in that parlor in December 1841? Why did he risk everything for her? And what happened when the secret finally exploded into public view? The answers will take us into one of the darkest, strangest, most deliberately buried scandals in American history. Let me take you back to where it all began. Kentucky, 1790s. The world Richard Johnson was born into. Richard Mentor Johnson entered the world in 1780, son of Robert Johnson, a wealthy plantation owner in Scott County, Kentucky. The Johnsons weren't just rich, they were powerful. Robert Johnson owned over 50 enslaved people, hundreds of acres, and had connections to every important family in Kentucky. Young Richard grew up in a world where white supremacy wasn't just accepted, it was the foundation of everything. But something happened to Richard Johnson that nobody expected. He got an education, not just reading and writing. He studied law. He read Enlightenment philosophy. He learned about natural rights, human dignity, the idea that all men are created equal. And somewhere in his teenage years, a question started forming in his mind that would haunt him forever. If all men are created equal, then what about the people his family enslaved? It's 1804. Richard Johnson is 24 years old, newly elected to the Kentucky legislature when he meets her. Julia Chinn, 16 years old, described in fragmentary records as having light brown skin, intelligent eyes, and a presence that made people remember her. She was born enslaved on the Johnson plantation, property. According to every law in Kentucky, she was no different than a horse or a piece of furniture. But Richard Johnson saw something else. He saw a person. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. Johnson's defenders say it was love. His enemies say it was exploitation, rape disguised as romance. The truth, like everything in history involving slavery, is probably more complicated and more horrifying than either version admits. Here's what we know for certain. By 1808, Richard Johnson and Julia Chinn were living together openly on his plantation, Great Crossings, near Georgetown, Kentucky. Not as master and slave, as partners. He called her his wife, though no legal marriage existed. She ran the plantation when he was in Washington. She educated their daughters, Adeline and Imogene. She hosted dinners for his political friends. And here's the thing that made everyone lose their minds. Johnson didn't hide her. He didn't keep Julia as a secret mistress in a cabin out back like Thomas Jefferson did with Sally Hemings. He brought her to public events. He introduced her as his partner. He put her in charge of his business affairs. In 1810's Kentucky, this wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. But Richard Johnson was becoming too powerful to ignore. War of 1812 breaks out, and Johnson leads Kentucky volunteer cavalry at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. Legend says he personally killed Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader. Whether that's true or not, Johnson comes home a war hero, wounded multiple times, celebrated in newspapers, famous across the frontier, famous enough that when he returns to Julia Chinn, people can't quite bring themselves to destroy him. Not yet, because he's useful. Kentucky needs him in Washington. So they look away, they whisper, they gossip. But they don't act. For 15 years, Richard Johnson and Julia Chinn live in what can only be called an impossible compromise. She's legally enslaved, but functionally free. She's his wife in everything but name. Their daughters, Adeline and Imogene, are technically enslaved under Kentucky law because they're born to an enslaved mother, but Johnson ensures they're educated, cultured, treated like ladies. And then, in 1829, something happens that changes everything. Andrew Jackson becomes president, and Jackson loves Richard Johnson, sees him as a fellow war hero, a man of the people, someone who isn't afraid to break stupid rules. Jackson starts pushing Johnson for higher office, governor of Kentucky, maybe senator, maybe even vice president. But there's a problem. The problem has a name, Julia Chinn, because now people aren't whispering anymore. They're screaming. Newspapers across the South start publishing vicious attacks. Race mixing, mongrel daughters, abomination. The aristocratic families of Kentucky, who had tolerated Johnson's arrangement when he was just a congressman, now see him as a threat to the entire social order. And Julia Chinn knows it. In 1833, she sits Richard down and tells him something that breaks his heart. "You have to choose, your career or me." Johnson refuses. He tells her he'll never abandon her, never deny their family, never pretend she doesn't exist. And Julia, who has spent her entire life watching white men sacrifice black women for their own comfort, doesn't quite believe him. Then, in August 1833, cholera sweeps through Kentucky. Cholera doesn't care about politics or race or scandal. It kills rich and poor, black and white. And on August 7th, 1833, it kills Julia Chinn. Richard Johnson is devastated. According to letters from friends, he locks himself in his study for 3 days. Doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, just sits with her body until the law forces him to bury her. He arranges a funeral that shocks Kentucky. Full honors, open mourning, a gravestone with her name. And then he does something even stranger. He legally emancipates their daughters, Adeline and Imogene, and sets them up with property, education, marriages to white men who are willing to accept them. It's as close to legitimizing his family as the law will allow. His enemies think this is the end of the story. Julia Chinn is dead. Johnson will now settle down, marry a respectable white woman, and stop embarrassing Kentucky. They're wrong, because in 1836, something impossible happens. Andrew Jackson personally pushes Richard Johnson to be Martin Van Buren's running mate for vice president. The Democratic Party is horrified. Southern Democrats threaten to revolt. They refuse to vote for a man who lived openly with a black woman, who raised mixed-race daughters, who refuses to apologize for any of it. But Jackson forces it through. And in one of the strangest elections in American history, Richard Mentor Johnson becomes the only vice president ever elected by the Senate instead of the Electoral College, because Virginia's electors refused to vote for him. Richard Johnson is now vice president of the United States, second highest office in the land, and his political enemies are waiting for him to fail. They don't have to wait long. December 1841. Johnson is no longer vice president. Van Buren lost re-election in 1840. Johnson has returned to Kentucky, politically wounded but not destroyed. He's considering running for governor. And then rumors start spreading. Rumors so scandalous that newspapers are afraid to print them at first. Richard Johnson has remarried, in secret, to another black woman, an enslaved woman he owns. At first, people don't believe it. Julia Chinn has been dead for 8 years. Johnson is 61 years old. Why would he do this now? Why would he commit political suicide a second time? But then a letter surfaces, written by a Presbyterian minister in Georgetown, Kentucky, describing a ceremony he witnessed in December 1841 at Johnson's estate, a wedding between Richard Johnson and a woman identified only as a mulatto woman, property of said Johnson. The letter doesn't name her. It doesn't explain why Johnson married her. It just confirms that it happened. And when newspapers finally dare to print the story in early 1842, The reaction is volcanic. Southern newspapers explode with rage. The Charleston Mercury calls it proof of moral degeneracy infecting Northern-influenced politicians. The Richmond Enquirer demands Johnson be tried for violating miscegenation laws. Kentucky's legislature debates censuring him, but here's where the story gets truly strange. Johnson doesn't deny it. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't hide. Instead, he doubles down. He starts appearing in public with the woman he married, taking her to church, to political events, to dinners with shocked Kentucky aristocrats who don't know whether to faint or call the sheriff. And slowly, people start learning her name. Josephine Johnson, as she now calls herself. Age unknown, background unknown. Some records suggest she was Julia Chinn's younger sister, enslaved on the same plantation. Others claim she was Julia's daughter from a previous relationship, which would make the marriage even more taboo. Nobody knows for sure because Johnson refuses to explain. What we do know is this. For the next 8 years, until his death in 1850, Richard Johnson lives openly with Josephine Johnson as his wife. He never holds major political office again. His career is effectively over. Kentucky society shuns him. But he doesn't care. Or maybe he does care, but he's made a decision that matters more than politics. A decision that in 1840s, America seems impossible. He's choosing love over power, a black woman over white supremacy, family over career, and in doing so, he's exposing something that makes everyone deeply uncomfortable. Because here's what Richard Johnson's story reveals. The whole system, the entire structure of Southern slavery and Northern complicity, depends on one fundamental lie, that interracial relationships are unnatural, that white men don't love black women, that the mixed-race children born on every plantation in America are accidents, unfortunate incidents, proof of black women's immorality rather than white men's desire. Richard Johnson's 2 marriages, his public acknowledgement of his black families, his refusal to hide or apologize, destroy that lie completely, and that's why his story had to be erased. After Johnson dies in 1850, something remarkable happens. His story starts disappearing from history. Biographers skip over Julia Chinn and Josephine entirely, or mention them in vague terms as housekeepers or servants. History textbooks that mention Johnson as vice president never explain why he was controversial. His gravestone in Georgetown makes no mention of his wives. Even more strange, records vanish. The marriage certificate from 1841 disappears from county records. Letters between Johnson and his daughters are lost or destroyed. Josephine Johnson herself vanishes from historical record. After 1850, no death record, no grave, nothing. It's as if someone, or many people, decided that Richard Johnson's impossible marriages needed to be forgotten, but they couldn't erase everything. In 2008, a historian named Melvin Urofsky discovered something extraordinary in the Library of Congress archives, a cache of letters between Richard Johnson and his daughters from the 1840s. The letters confirm everything: the marriages, the families, the deliberate choice Johnson made to prioritize love over political ambition, and they reveal something else, something heartbreaking. In a letter to his daughter Adeline written in 1848, 2 years before his death, Johnson writes this: "I am asked constantly why I have chosen this path when easier roads lay before me. I answer that I have known 2 women in my life who saw me not as a senator or a vice president or a war hero, but simply as a man. One was your mother. One is my wife now. If choosing to honor them makes me a villain in the eyes of history, then I accept that judgment. Better to be a villain who loved truly than a hero who loved nothing but power." Those words were written by a man who had been vice president of the United States. A man who could have had anything he wanted if he just followed the rules. But he didn't. He chose something that in 1840s, America was supposed to be impossible. He chose to treat black women as human beings worthy of love, respect, and marriage. Today, Richard Mentor Johnson is barely remembered. Most Americans have never heard his name. History textbooks mention him as a footnote, if at all. The impossible mystery of his marriages has been successfully buried for over 150 years, but the questions remain. Did he truly love Julia Chinn and Josephine Johnson, or was it still exploitation dressed up as romance? Can love exist within the framework of slavery, or is the power imbalance always rape? Was Johnson a progressive hero defying racist laws, or a slaveholder who just happened to treat two enslaved women slightly better than the norm? The honest answer is probably all of the above. Richard Johnson was a man of impossible contradictions. He fought for democracy while owning human beings. He loved black women while participating in a system that enslaved them. He defied social norms while still benefiting from white male privilege. He was, in other words, America in miniature. A nation built on the impossible contradiction of proclaiming all men are created equal while enslaving millions. A country that still hasn't fully reckoned with that original sin. The impossible mystery of the senator who married his slave in secret isn't really about Richard Johnson at all. It's about what his story reveals. That interracial love existed even in the depths of slavery. That some white men did see black women as human beings, even if imperfectly. That the color line wasn't as absolute as either side wanted to believe. That history is always more complicated, more contradictory, more human than the sanitized versions we're taught. And that's exactly why his story had to be erased. Because it made people uncomfortable. Because it challenged myths. Because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, the whole system was built on lies that even its beneficiaries couldn't always believe. Richard Mentor Johnson died on November 19, 1850, in Frankfort, Kentucky. He was 70 years old. The newspapers barely mentioned his death. No state funeral, no monuments, just a quiet burial in a family plot. Josephine Johnson, his second wife, vanished from history that same year. No record of what happened to her. No grave, no mention in any document. She became, like Julia Chinn, like Adeline and Imogene, like thousands of black women who loved and were loved by white men in slavery times, a ghost. But ghosts have a way of returning, and the impossible mystery of the senator who married his slave in secret keeps haunting America, demanding we finally tell the truth about who we were, who we are, and what love means in a country still struggling with the legacy of slavery. Because Richard Johnson's story isn't really about the past, it's about now, about interracial families still facing discrimination, about black women still being told their relationships don't matter, about a country that still hasn't figured out how to reconcile its ideals with its history. The impossible mystery isn't what happened in that parlor in December 1841. The impossible mystery is why we're still so afraid to talk about it,